Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the truth about NATO, why it was formed, and why it is still sparking wars and security crises right now. In this video, you are going to see the post-war panic that gave birth to NATO, the fine print in the treaty that most people never read, the cold logic of deterrence and its incentive traps, and how a defensive alliance can slowly evolve into something far bigger than its founders imagined. And here is the hook: what if NATO is not simply a force for peace or a machine for war, but a system that changes how countries behave, how risks get priced, and how conflicts become more or less likely depending on credibility, perception, and political incentives? So let's start where all of this actually begins, not in a conference room, but in the rubble of Europe after 1945. Picture a continent physically shattered, economically exhausted, and politically fragile. Whole cities are broken, industries are disrupted, currencies and trade networks are strained, and millions of people are displaced and desperate. In that environment, power vacuums are not theoretical, they are invitations. Weak states cannot easily defend themselves, and when governments are fragile, outside pressure has a much easier time bending outcomes. Now add the reality that the Soviet Union, after helping defeat Nazi Germany, emerges with enormous military power and a growing sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. Western leaders watch coercion, political pressure, and the consolidation of Soviet-aligned regimes, and they start thinking in a very specific way, not just who has the bigger army, but how quickly could the map change if nobody draws a line. And then comes the fear that really concentrates the mind, the idea that ad hoc alliances, last-minute coalitions, and vague promises are too slow when a crisis hits. Because when you are dealing with a potential aggressor, uncertainty is dangerous. If you cannot predict whether the United States, Britain, France, and others will respond together, you increase the odds that someone tests the boundary. So the post-war years produce a grim question that hangs over every cabinet meeting: if a small country is pressured or attacked, do we respond as a unified bloc, or do we hesitate and negotiate while the facts on the ground harden? And here's the uncomfortable twist: that fear can be rational, but it can also become self-reinforcing. When both sides interpret the other's moves as threats, even defensive choices can look like preparation for offense. So from the very beginning, the NATO story is not a comic book of heroes and villains. It is a story about shattered societies, strategic uncertainty, and leaders trying to build a security arrangement strong enough to prevent another catastrophe, while quietly risking the creation of new ones. Before NATO becomes fighter jets, press conferences, and summit photos, it starts as something much less cinematic but far more powerful: a legal contract, written down in black and white. And this matters because most arguments about NATO are really arguments about what people think the alliance promised, versus what the treaty actually says. At the center is Article 5, the famous Collective Defense Clause, the line everyone summarizes as if an attack on one is an attack on all. But here is the fine print that changes everything: the treaty does not force identical responses, it commits members to assist, and each country decides what it considers necessary, which means the obligation is real, but the exact form is political. So if you are wondering why leaders obsess over credibility and signaling, this is why. A treaty can create expectations, but it cannot automate courage. Then there is Article 1, which is almost never the headline, but it is foundational to NATO's self-image, a commitment to settle disputes peacefully and to avoid using force in ways inconsistent with the United Nations framework. Put that next to the later controversies you have heard about, and you start to see the tension baked into the alliance's DNA. And then there is Article 10, the Open Door Clause, which sounds simple on paper but becomes explosive in practice. NATO can invite other European states to join if they meet certain conditions. On the surface, that feels like voluntary alignment, like choosing a neighborhood watch. But to rivals, it can look like the neighborhood watch steadily moving its fence line. So slide 2 is the key that unlocks the rest of the story. NATO is not just a military presence, it is a treaty framework that mixes binding promises with flexible discretion, and once you combine that with fear, perception, and domestic politics, you get a system where the words on the page can shape war and peace for decades. Now we get to the engine room, the part of NATO that is less about speeches and more about psychology: deterrence as a system. Think of deterrence like a giant security sign on a house, but the sign only works if the potential burglar believes the alarm is real, believes someone will actually respond, and believes the cost will be unbearable. NATO's deterrence works the same way. It is designed to raise the expected price of aggression by pooling the response of multiple states, so that attacking one member is no longer a neat, local gamble, but a high-risk move that could trigger a larger conflict. But here is the thing students always miss at first: deterrence is not only about tanks and missiles, it is about credibility, and credibility is a political asset that can be strengthened or quietly drained. If an adversary doubts that members will unify when it matters, deterrence weakens even if the hardware stays the same. And then we run into the incentive traps that every alliance faces. First, the free rider problem. If I am a small member under a big umbrella, I benefit from protection even if I spend less on defense, because the guarantee still covers me. That is rational behavior for each individual actor, but if too many actors do it, the system as a whole becomes fragile. Second, the credibility problem. Leaders may want to promise ironclad commitment, but their publics have elections, budgets have limits, and crises always arrive at inconvenient times. So deterrence requires constant maintenance, military planning, readiness, and the repeated demonstration that the promise is not a bluff. And notice the deeper pattern here. Anytime you create a system that offers insurance, you also create moral hazard, the subtle temptation for protected actors to take risks they might avoid if they stood alone. That does not mean NATO automatically causes reckless behavior, but it does mean the incentives exist, and history tends to punish societies that pretend incentives do not matter. So on this slide, NATO begins to look less like a simple alliance and more like a living mechanism, one that can prevent conflict through fear of consequences, yet also generate tension when credibility wobbles, burdens feel unfair, or rivals interpret defensive posture as a rehearsal for offense. During the Cold War, NATO becomes what I like to call a containment engine, not because it is constantly firing, but because it is constantly shaping the strategic environment. The alliance's core product in this era is predictability. Instead of every crisis forcing frantic diplomacy and last-minute bargaining, NATO creates an integrated framework where planning is coordinated, expectations are clearer, and the frontier of commitment is meant to be unmistakable. That matters because uncertainty is one of the great accelerants of war. If Moscow is unsure how the West will respond, it might probe. If Washington is unsure whether allies will hold, it might hesitate. NATO is built to reduce those dangerous unknowns by making the response system more automatic in practice, even if it is not automatic in law. It standardizes doctrine, coordinates command structures, and signals that the cost of pushing into NATO territory would be catastrophic. But there is a trade-off here, and it is the kind that only shows up when you think in systems. When you bind states tightly together, you reduce the chance of miscalculation in one direction, but you also lock them into shared risk. You are not just defending your own borders anymore, you are defending the credibility of the entire architecture. And credibility becomes a strategic asset that leaders feel compelled to protect, sometimes even when the marginal issue is small, because if you let one piece slip, rivals might question the whole. So NATO during the Cold War is not merely about preventing invasion, it is about maintaining a stable equilibrium where everyone knows the rules of the game, and no one believes they can change the map without paying an unbearable price. And that is why, paradoxically, the alliance can be both stabilizing and tense at the same time. Stabilizing, because it deters. Tense, because deterrence works by making the possibility of escalation believable. The Cold War peace in Europe, to the extent it holds, is not the absence of force, it is force organized into a predictable system that tries to make war irrational. Now imagine being an institution built for a single overriding threat, and then that threat collapses. The Soviet Union falls apart, the Cold War ends, and suddenly the question that haunts NATO is simple but existential: what are we for now? Institutions rarely like to shrink, because shrinking means fewer budgets, fewer careers, fewer missions, and less relevance. So NATO largely adapts by expanding its scope, and this is where the story starts to feel controversial, because the alliance's identity begins to stretch beyond territorial defense. Instead of focusing only on protecting member borders, NATO increasingly takes on crisis management, stabilization, and operations beyond its original geographic center of gravity. And notice what changes when the mission changes. In a pure collective defense model, the moral logic is straightforward: defend members from attack. But in an intervention or crisis management model, you enter a world of messy civil conflicts, humanitarian arguments, contested legitimacy, and unclear end states. The incentives shift too. Success becomes harder to define, timelines get longer, accountability gets more diffused across many governments, and the gap between stated goals and actual outcomes can widen. This is what I mean by strategic drift. Not necessarily malicious, not necessarily inevitable, but structurally likely. Because if you keep a large security apparatus active, it will find problems that justify its activity. Sometimes that can genuinely prevent suffering. Sometimes it can create blowback, resentment, or instability that only becomes visible years later. So this slide is the hinge between NATO as a Cold War deterrent and NATO as a post-Cold War actor in a broader set of conflicts. And the core question we carry forward is this: when an alliance built to stop a war becomes an alliance that manages wars, how does that change the way it is perceived by outsiders and understood by its own publics? Enlargement is where NATO stops being just a defense pact among a fixed group and starts becoming a moving boundary in the minds of both supporters and opponents, and that is why it is so emotionally charged. On paper, enlargement looks like a straightforward idea. Sovereign countries choose to join a collective security club because they believe it improves their safety, their stability, and even their economic confidence. If you are a small or medium state with traumatic memories of invasion, occupation, or political pressure, the promise of being under a credible defensive umbrella is not an abstract theory, it is a survival strategy. Membership can also signal institutional alignment with the West, which investors and governments often interpret as a form of long-term predictability. But here is where systems thinking matters, because what feels defensive from the inside can feel threatening from the outside. To a rival power, every new member can look like the buffer space is shrinking, the strategic depth is narrowing, and the worst-case scenario is getting closer. And when security planners think in worst-case scenarios, they do not ask what you intend, they ask what you could do if intentions change. That is why enlargement produces two interpretations that can both be sincere. One side sees voluntary security alignment, a set of countries freely choosing their preferred security arrangements. The other side sees strategic encroachment, a gradual shift in the balance of power right up to sensitive borders. And once those perceptions harden, every new accession is not just a diplomatic event, it becomes a symbolic statement about the future order in Europe. So if you want to understand why NATO sparks wars and crises in the modern era, you have to understand enlargement as a credibility and perception shock. It changes what states believe is possible, it changes what they fear, and it can push rivals to plan, posture, and sometimes act in ways that become self-fulfilling. Here is the part that surprises people who think hostility was inevitable. NATO and Russia did not start the post-Cold War era as permanent enemies locked in a script. There were structured attempts to build a relationship, formal language about partnership, and official mechanisms meant to reduce the chance of misunderstanding. A key symbol of that effort is the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, which tries to establish cooperation and a shared security framework, at least on paper. But paper is not trust, and trust is not just about what you sign, it is about what you believe the other side will do when incentives shift. This is where the famous not 1 inch dispute enters the story, and it matters because it reveals a deeper problem. States do not only argue about facts, they argue about meaning. Different actors interpret the same diplomatic moment differently, then they build policy on that interpretation, and over time the interpretation becomes a political reality. If one side believes promises were made and later violated, it hardens into grievance. If the other side believes no binding promise existed, it hardens into dismissal. And once mistrust takes root, the system begins to amplify it. Each defensive measure is read as preparation for offense. Each reassurance is read as propaganda. Cooperation mechanisms weaken, and the political appetite to sustain them collapses. So the story here is not simply that cooperation failed, it is that the relationship moved from cautious partnership to compounding suspicion, and in a security environment, suspicion is not passive. It changes doctrine, it changes posture, it changes what leaders consider rational. And when both sides begin planning around worst-case assumptions, even small incidents can feel like proof that the worst case is arriving. Kosovo is one of those moments where history quietly changes direction, because it forces NATO into a moral and legal tension that does not have an easy resolution. The intervention is framed, by many of its advocates, as a response to humanitarian catastrophe, a case where diplomacy failed, civilians were at risk, and doing nothing felt like complicity. But the controversy is not just about motives, it is about authorization and precedent. Critics point to the disputed relationship between the operation and explicit UN Security Council approval, and once you enter that debate, you are no longer talking only about Kosovo, you are talking about the rules that govern force in the international system. Here is the awkward truth: when powerful actors treat a rule as flexible in an emergency, they may solve the immediate problem, but they also teach everyone else that the rule is flexible. And the international system has a memory. Later, rival powers can point back and say, you normalized exceptions when it suited you, so do not act shocked when we do the same. That is what makes Kosovo a precedent, not just an event. It becomes part of the argumentative toolkit of global politics. And from a systems perspective, this is how legitimacy erodes, not through one dramatic betrayal, but through repeated moments where the lines blur and the justification becomes situational. So on this slide, NATO is no longer only the shield of collective defense. It is an actor navigating humanitarian claims, legal frameworks, and strategic consequences, and the viewer is left with a serious question: if you believe intervention can be morally necessary, how do you prevent the exception from becoming the loophole that future aggressors drive through? Afghanistan is the moment where Article 5 stops being theory and becomes history, because it is the only time NATO has formally invoked the Collective Defense Clause, and that single fact should make you pause. After the attacks of September 11th, NATO treats terrorism as a collective security threat, and the alliance commits itself to assisting the United States. But what begins as a response to a specific trigger evolves into something far more complicated, because NATO eventually assumes command of the International Security Assistance Force, and with that comes the reality of long operations, coalition politics, and goals that can expand faster than results. This is the classic mission expansion dilemma. You start with a clear justification: prevent further attacks, disrupt networks, stabilize a situation. Then the mission stretches into rebuilding institutions, shaping governance, training forces, and trying to create a durable political order. And here is where the structure of alliances matters. When many governments share a mission, responsibility can become diluted. Everyone owns it, so no one fully owns it. Success is hard to define, failure is hard to assign, and exit becomes politically costly because leaving can look like abandoning allies, abandoning credibility, or admitting that the original aims were not achievable on the promised timeline. So Afghanistan becomes a lesson in how collective defense can morph into prolonged nation-building incentives even when that was not the original plan. And the deeper takeaway is uncomfortable. Once a large security system is activated, it can generate momentum that is difficult to reverse, because the alliance is not just fighting an enemy, it is defending its own reputation for unity and resolve. Libya is a case study in how narrow authorizations can produce enormous outcomes, especially when the immediate military goal is clearer than the political future that follows. The legal starting point is UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which authorizes protection of civilians and a no-fly zone, and NATO takes the lead in enforcing that framework. In other words, the official logic is limited: prevent mass harm, stop the air power that could be used against civilians, create space for protection. But once military force is applied, the chain of consequences rarely stays inside the neat boundaries of a resolution. This is what people mean by mandate creep, the gradual expansion from a defined protective mission into actions that effectively reshape the political trajectory of a country. And even if the intent is not regime change, the outcome can still be a regime collapsing, because war is not a scalpel, it is more like a hammer in a room full of glass. The deeper issue here is incentives and planning. It is easier for coalitions to agree on stopping something horrible in the short term than on building something stable in the long term. Post-conflict planning is expensive, politically risky, and hard to coordinate across many governments, so it is often underpowered relative to the scale of the disruption. And that leaves the viewer with a hard, grown-up question: if intervention reduces immediate harm but increases long-run instability, how should history judge it? Libya forces you to confront the gap between authorization and outcome, and it reminds you that centralized decisions made far from the ground can carry consequences that outlive the headlines, long after the cameras have moved on. NATO today operates in what I would call the credibility era, where perception, signaling, and domestic politics can be as decisive as physical force, because deterrence is ultimately a belief system. One of the most important modern flashpoints is Ukraine, where you hear constant debate about security guarantees that sound like Article 5 but are not actually Article 5, and that distinction is not just legal trivia, it is the difference between a locked door and a door with a security camera that may or may not be monitored. When leaders discuss Article 5 type guarantees without membership, they are trying to hedge, to strengthen deterrence without triggering the full political commitment that membership implies. But hedges can be unstable, because adversaries test ambiguity. And then you have the alliance cohesion problem. Public doubts about whether Article 5 would truly be honored can weaken deterrence even if the treaty text never changes, because deterrence depends on what others think you will do, not what you say you believe. Add to that the burden-sharing tensions, the recurring fight over defense spending targets and who pays how much, which is really the free rider problem in modern clothing. The more the alliance expands and the more the threat environment intensifies, the more those disputes matter, because they signal unity or disunity to the outside world. And here's the dramatic irony: NATO can look strongest when it is most united, but the very pressures that make unity necessary are also the pressures that strain it: different threat perceptions, different domestic constraints, different histories, different appetites for risk. So this slide is telling you that the wars and crises around NATO are not only about weapons. They are about commitment, messaging, political will, and the way a system of collective defense can become a global focal point where every statement, every budget, and every election can slightly shift the strategic temperature. So here is the honest conclusion, and it is probably not the one people want on social media: NATO is neither a pure shield of peace nor a cartoon villain that automatically manufactures wars. It is a system, and systems reshape incentives. NATO can deter aggression and protect smaller states, but it can also create entanglement risks, credibility traps, and a politics of escalation where leaders feel pressure to act to defend the reputation of the alliance as much as the immediate interests at stake. That is the moral tension: protection versus entanglement. Then there is the institutional tension: centralized security guarantees can reduce the risk of war in one domain while raising friction in another, because rivals respond to capabilities and positions, not just stated intentions. And once an alliance becomes deeply integrated, decisions become path-dependent, meaning you inherit commitments you did not personally sign, and it becomes difficult to reverse course without paying political costs. Which brings us to agency. Who actually decides? Is it voters? Is it parliaments? Is it executive branches? Is it bureaucracies that outlast elections? If security is a service, what does accountability even look like when the service is delivered by a multinational structure that can outlive the public mood? And I want to leave you with 3 questions that matter more than any talking point. Security for whom? At what cost? And who decides? If you enjoyed this kind of thoughtful, entertaining history, like the video, comment with your take on NATO's biggest turning point, and subscribe to Truth Behind History for more deep dives that challenge the simple narratives and bring the real incentives and trade-offs into the light.